Well, let's take a look at our top story. The Taliban are said to be hunting down individuals who helped America and NATO forces. It's all according to a new report by the United Nations. The group did say, the Taliban, they said they would not be doing this. But the on-the-ground reports say violence, and not only that, executions have already been taking place.
Joining us now is Afzal Amin. He served 11 years in the British Army, and 3 of those were focused on counter-insurgency strategy in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013. Mr. Amin, I hear they're hunting down journalists at the moment, aren't they?
There are numerous reports coming in like that, and it's, of course, extremely worrying that is the case, if it's happening in anywhere near the scale that is being reported. Before we discuss that, I just want to say very quickly, I've seen this morning footage of 16th Air Assault Brigade and other British Army personnel working in Kabul airport, and I just want to just do a shout out and pay tribute to the great work that they're doing, particularly in how they're handling the crowds with such restraint. It really is a very impressive result of their great training.
This is such a complex situation, and the Taliban are in part motivated to paint a situation to the West that things are maybe under more control and more steady than they actually are. Some journalists saying it's actually quite difficult now even to film around the airport because they don't want those pictures of the chaos being broadcast around the Western world. How difficult is it now for America, us, other countries trying to evacuate people to actually get a real picture of what's happening?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. It's absolutely very, very hard. And the reason is partly because of why the Taliban were able to defeat so many of the forces that were set against them. Because the Taliban is a disparate, myriad organization representing so many different groups within Afghanistan. And you'll remember about 20 years ago, the example of the starfish and the spider in terms of management analysis. So the Taliban are very much like a starfish organization, lots of small groups that act quite independently of the headquarters. And the headquarters, of course, is on this huge PR offensive to try and convince the West that they have changed, that they do want an equal, free, fair society, that they have this amnesty to forgive anyone that opposed them in the past. But within the Taliban itself, there's going to be groups undoubtedly motivated by a whole range of other ways of thinking, particularly to do with revenge. And if you try and look at it from their perspective, which any good counterinsurgent strategist tries to do, you're dealing with people who've been at war as an organization for 20 years. They've got family members who've been killed, children who've been killed in airstrikes and house raids and so on. And there's a lot of vengeance out there that they want to mete out anyone they suspect of having helped the people who did that to them. And it's going to take a very big effort from the Taliban leadership sitting in Kabul to control all of the different groups within the organization. I would say that hope is not lost yet. There may be some bloodletting, but the international community has many options to put pressure on the Taliban to try and reduce this kind of atrocity being committed.
What are those options?
Well, primarily they're to do with engagement at the strategic level. The Taliban are human beings like us. They have their hopes, their desires, they have their stated policies, they have challenges within their own organizations of how those policies are being put forward and being implemented. So, yeah, I mean, there are a huge number of opportunities for us to propose to people in Afghanistan what a better way of life could be, something which, unfortunately, during my time in counterinsurgency strategy at NATO, we weren't very good at doing. And much of what's happened is no surprise to any of us who worked in this field of trying to win the battle of ideas. So much of what was predicted 10 years ago has now come to pass. And this is probably the biggest tragedy. I read yesterday that $2.26 trillion is so far the cost of going into Afghanistan for the Americans. And that cost is growing at about $500 billion a year with interest payments and increasing costs of looking after soldiers and other military personnel who've been injured. So this is a very, very expensive war that we've prosecuted. And we have to ask ourselves, could it have been done better? And if it could have been, then what are we going to do next that ensures that we don't have these sorts of costs or the threats against us that are undoubtedly rising as a result of this failure?
Well, you mentioned that we can put international pressure on the Taliban and hope that has an effect. But is it actually possible? You mentioned there are disparate groups there. Is there a hierarchy? Do the HQ, as you call them, actually liaise with the disparate groups?
I'm sure they do, because we've seen all sorts of footage with the use of radios. And during the ceasefire over the last couple of years, As far as we know, there were no cases of the ceasefire being broken. So I think there is a degree of discipline in the rank and file of the Taliban groups under the pressure of the environment where people are protesting quite legitimately that they want an inclusive government, they want women's rights to be properly attended to, they want children to go to schools, particularly girls. In that battle of who has control, I'm sure there will be infringements on people's rights and so on. And it's going to be very tough for a long time to come. The amount of pressure we can apply on them directly, I think, is rather limited. But indirectly, through our allies and our partner nations across the world, I think there's a lot we can do to shape the Taliban into becoming something closer to what we'd like to see rather than what would happen otherwise.
That is going to be a real challenge, particularly of Western politicians. Just some breaking news. We are hearing that Boris Johnson is going to chair an emergency COBRA meeting this afternoon. You know, considering that, when you're looking at the UK government's handling of the evacuation process and their actions, how much faith do you have in them?
So I think crisis management is something which the military specialise in. So I have a huge amount of faith in 16th Air Assault Brigade delivering what they've been asked to deliver, which is to evacuate British nationals and other entitled people out of Afghanistan into a safe environment, most likely into a transit base, and then after that for further travel onto the UK. And we must consider who we're going to receive here. We're going to receive people who speak English for the majority, who are qualified in all sorts of technical ways, doctors, engineers, lawyers, people who are going to make a massive contribution to our society if they are properly handled. So I think 16th Air Assault Brigade are going to do a great job. I've got no doubt at all about their ability to operate. There's always going to be a disconnect between headlines in London that politicians are battling with and military operations on the ground. So I do have a degree of sympathy with the very top of our political leadership. It is extremely hard. It's an extremely fluid situation. And we mustn't forget the most important thing here. Donald Trump had a 3-year plan of a negotiated end to this impossible war and a leaving of the exiting from the theatre. It was Biden that blew that plan, and that pulled the rug out of everyone's feet, not just the NATO forces and the British forces and so on, but also of the Afghan forces and the Afghan government. That's led to this catastrophic situation where there's just chaos. So it is a very, very tough situation. And I think all of us need to be slightly more forgiving where mistakes happen, because I assure you that this much, having worked in a range of organizations from the Conservative Party all the way down to the army, that people do have good intentions. And we see that played out again and again. But mistakes are inevitable in such a crisis situation.
Afzal Amin, thank you very much. Spent 11 years